In the last episode, we told you it was going to be 2 weeks until you saw us again, but we lied. Today on Hit the Table, we're talking about role-playing games. The role-playing game is one of the most popular, successful, and beloved genres in all of video gaming. Anyone who's sunk hours into Final Fantasy, Baldur's Gate, Mass Effect, or any other number of RPGs is already well aware of this fact. But not everyone is aware that the genesis of this genre actually comes from the tabletop, and when they discover that the mechanics and inner workings of these games are actually based on Dungeons & Dragons and its peers, they're shocked. There's a stigma attached to tabletop RPGs that we are hoping to break, because storytelling with your friends is about as much fun as you can have. It's a great form of entertainment and a great way to be social. Board games are often introduced to us at a very early age, and so we have a fundamental understanding of what they're trying to accomplish. But the role-playing game can be a bit nebulous to an outsider. It's hard to understand exactly what these people are doing, sitting around pretending to be dwarves and elves and going on adventures. What exactly is a role-playing game? At its core, the RPG is a form of improvisational theater that's been combined with the numerical strategy of wargaming. Players are responsible for creating complex characters, assigning numerical values to certain abilities and traits that increase their ability to succeed in certain situations. For example, a character with a high score in strength might have an easier time lifting a car off a victim than somebody who's focused more in intelligence. However, most of these numbers are only important because they determine the outcome of events in the story. It's also important that the player spend time developing a background and a motivation for the character, something that's more based in story and narrative. This is really your chance to create and customize a distinct individual and take them through an arc of growth as the game presses on. However, there's one role at the table that's arguably more important than any of the others, and that is the Game Master. A Game Master is equal parts referee and narrator. He creates the story, he creates the environment, and he creates the characters that the players will interact with. As such, you could consider the Game Master a guiding hand, whose job it is to make sure that everyone at the table is having the most amount of fun that they could possibly have. It's also important that they have a complete knowledge of the rules, because it falls on the shoulder of the Game Master to interpret situations that may not be considered in the main rulebook. The GM is very often your best friend and your worst enemy. He builds the world that you're playing in, but he also creates all of the obstacles that stand in your way. When it comes time to play, it's the Game Master's responsibility to weave whatever complex plot he has in his mind, but ultimately it's the player's decisions that change the way things will go. A Game Master has to be good at improvising and adapting, as players constantly will send them off the rails. This is a good thing, because tabletop role-playing games offer a freedom that no other form of entertainment can possibly give you at this time. You really are able to do whatever you want, as long as it's within the context and rules of the game system you're playing. When important decisions need to be made, or an event occurs and action needs to be taken, the players roll a 20-sided die. It's not always 20-sided, sometimes it's 6-sided. It really depends on the system that you're playing with. But in general, you add the value of the roll to whatever statistic best fits that action. If I'm trying to catch my breath during a chase, that might be an endurance roll. If I'm trying to break a lock, that might be a thievery roll. It really depends on what you're trying to accomplish. Once you have the total, the Game Master compares it to a difficulty level. If you beat that difficulty level, you succeed. If not, you fail. And it's his job to determine what that means. This is the base mechanic for just about every role-playing game ever made. You want to increase the statistical chances of your character's ability to succeed in given events. But the reason you want to play in a group is that not every character can emphasize the same things. And so as such, it's important to have a team so that you can accomplish all of the goals set forth in front of you. All you really need to play a role-playing game is a set of dice, a pencil, some paper, and your boundless imagination. It also helps if somebody goes out and buys all the rulebooks. But once you have those rules in your hand, the possibilities are really endless. You can tell whatever story best suits you. This is one of the reasons that role-playing games are so hard to define, because they really can be different things to different groups. Some people just want a basic dungeon crawl. They want to go through, kill some monsters, grab some loot, and feel powerful. That's what they want from their game. Others will want a deep and interwoven plotline filled with intrigue. Some will want a mix of the two, and ultimately it's up to you to decide what's best for your players, what will make their experience the best. Then it's time to decide which system you want to use. There is a myriad of different ways to play role-playing games, more now than ever, and not all of them use the mechanics that I've talked about before, even though most of them do. We're going to narrow down a few of our favorites. What's important to keep in mind is that these are games that we would consider for people who are just starting out in the hobby, so we may not include some things like Pathfinder that are a little bit more advanced. Your first option is one that you've probably heard of, and one that most people outside of the RPG community have heard of as well. It's Dungeons and Dragons. This is the granddaddy of all role-playing games. Pretty much everything that's come after it has been influenced by it. There are currently 4 editions on the market that you can choose from, with a 5th coming very soon this summer. Older editions of the game have been made available digitally at dndclassics.com. But I tend to tell people to start with 4th edition, which is currently the most recent. This is a controversial statement for some gamers, because a lot of the more experienced folk who've played through every edition of D&D didn't particularly like 4th edition. They saw it as a major change from its roots, which it is, but one of the reasons I like 4th edition is that it's much easier to teach people who've never played a role-playing game before. A lot of the rhetoric that you find in this game is right out of video games, which is one of the major complaints from some of the veterans. But if you're new to role-playing games, it helps to have something to latch onto, and that's what 4th edition gives you. As always, Dungeons & Dragons 4th edition is an expansive fantasy role-playing experience that gives you the ability to do just about anything you could possibly want. There are a myriad of worlds to explore that they give you, and they give you even more options to create your own. D&D is one of the most heavily supported role-playing games. It's rare for any other game set to provide this much material for you to use at your table. What I love about this enormous selection is that it allows beginners to learn the core rules first and then expand out into any direction they wish to go. However, I will warn you that D&D 4th edition really does focus on combat. It wants you to use miniatures, and it wants you to have a strategy experience at your table, which is great for some people and not so great for others. If you want to be more focused in story, you might want to look into previous editions of D&D or into some of the other games on this list. Of course, you also have the option of simply waiting until D&D 5th edition comes out this summer, which might be a great option because it brings back a lot of the more classic elements of the game that some of the older players may enjoy and might bring them back to want to play with you. I had a chance to playtest the newest edition a few months ago for a limited amount of time, and I really enjoyed my experience with it. So if you're not quite sure that Dungeons & Dragons 4th edition is for you, but you still want to play around in a fantasy world, maybe wait for this one to come out. If you still want that Tolkien or Game of Thrones fix, but Dungeons & Dragons doesn't sound like it's for you, you can also check out Dungeon World, which I don't have a book for, so we're going to put up a graphic right here. There you go. Dungeon World is heavily influenced by our previous title, if that wasn't already clear. But what's great about it is that it really strips down a lot of the unnecessary elements of Dungeons & Dragons and really makes it so that it's a very simple game to play. It's great for newcomers, especially for those who are a little hesitant about all the complexities of role-playing games. This is a very simple system to learn, and it really focuses on the storytelling aspect as opposed to the strategy. Dungeon World has won numerous awards, and rightfully so, because its streamlined rules are a real improvement over a lot of older role-playing games. But what's really exciting is that Dungeon World isn't just about collaborative storytelling, it's also about collaborative world building. But what's really exciting is that it emphasizes the openness that role-playing games are so good at already. Rather than provide a highly detailed campaign setting, Dungeon World asks that the players work with the game master to build a setting, to build the environment and the characters that inhabit with it. They do this by creating very intense backgrounds for themselves, and also by just adding fluid details to the environment that you wouldn't get in another role-playing game. This all gives players an extra dimension with which to play. It adds to the fluidity of the game because you're not stopping to look at whether or not the world is accurate to what's being described, you're just adding the things that you'd really like to see. I'd also be remiss if I didn't mention that Dungeon World is actually based off of another game called Apocalypse World. This is a survival game that's really based in concepts that you'd find in something like Fallout. It's a post-apocalyptic wasteland and you have to survive. But similarly to Dungeon World, the game is very simple, very easy to learn, very pared down compared to other role-playing games, and a lot of people can get into it. So I think if that's something that sounds interesting, you might want to check that out as well. Next up, we have a game that combines the best elements of fantasy and science fiction, and it's one that I'm personally a fan of and that you're going to hear me talk about a lot because I really love the concept. It's called Numenera. So you might be asking, what makes Numenera so unique? Why is it different than Dungeon World or Dungeons & Dragons? Especially by the cover, you'd think that it's just another high fantasy game. But in fact, what makes Numenera so interesting is that it's a different take on the science fiction genre. The game actually takes place 1 billion years into Earth's future, after 9 great intergalactic civilizations have risen and fallen. The people of this 9th world live off of the ashes of the technologies of these ancient civilizations, although they're not really quite sure how to replicate the technology. It's very reminiscent of that idea from Isaac Asimov, that any sufficiently advanced technology should be indistinguishable from magic. And Numenera really explores this idea in depth, because it feels like most of the weapons, most of the technology that you're using is magical in some way, and yet there's a scientific basis behind all of it. It's a strange world, with surprises around every corner, and some of the most imaginative design I've ever seen in a role-playing game. There is so much creativity packed in this book, I can't emphasize it enough, and even if you don't play in the 9th world, many of the ideas will translate into other role-playing settings that you might be interested in. However, beyond the potential for amazing storytelling, Numenera's base gaming mechanisms are quite stunning as well. Character creation is a great example of the effortlessness of this system. Rather than having to worry about a lot of numbers and options, players fill out a simple sentence. I am a blank blank who blanks. In other words, you might construct a sentence that sounds something like, I am a clever warrior who focuses mind over matter. All of these different terms within the sentence define who you are and determine which numbers you need to put into your character sheet, so things feel a lot easier to deal with in Numenera. The game also makes it easy on game masters because they never have to roll a dice once. Instead, each monster or each enemy is given a base difficulty that the players have to defeat. If you're aware of how skilled your players are, it's easy to create a challenging scenario that everyone can have fun with. But Numenera is really a game about exploration, about the wonder and awe of discovering something that you've never seen before. And what's great is that this game allows you to really dig into your imagination for some crazy stuff that you can present to people in a way that makes sense. And with a world that's as engaging and unique as this one, it's hard for them not to be won over by role-playing games in general. And no doubt they'll be back to your table for more when the next session comes. Last but not least, we have a game for the Star Wars fans out there. And you might be surprised to know that Star Wars is probably the second most popular role-playing property after Dungeons & Dragons. But we're going to focus on the newest version of the game. It's called Star Wars Edge of the Empire. When Fantasy Flight Games acquired the Star Wars license a few years ago, they decided when they were making their role-playing properties that they were going to split the game into 3 distinct segments of the Star Wars mythos. The first, Edge of the Empire, is based on the criminal underworld, on the people who are in the bottom side of the galactic hierarchy. Later this year, we'll see Age of Rebellion, which will see a bigger focus on the Rebel Alliance and their civil war with the Imperials. And of course, once that's complete, they're going to make an installment called Force and Destiny, which will focus on the Jedi and the Sith. However, it's important to note that all of these games take place after most of the Jedi have been killed, and so the emphasis is not on Force powers and exploring the universe with a lightsaber on your hip. Instead, you're more of a classic Star Wars hero, like Luke Skywalker or Han Solo, who comes from nothing and makes something of himself. If you've ever wanted to explore the Star Wars galaxy as a smuggler or a bounty hunter, this game gives you everything you need to become the scum of the universe. There's a real attention to detail here, and the game is designed to tell dynamic stories that really feel as cinematic as Star Wars should. One of the ways that this is accomplished is that Edge of the Empire doesn't use your typical 20-sided die to make decisions. Instead, Fantasy Flight has produced a specific set of dice that is designed to be used with this game. Instead of numbers printed on them, there are symbols, and the symbols represent successes and failures. So when you're building your character, instead of adding your ability score to a die roll, that actually determines how many dice you should be rolling for that ability. So if you have a 3 in strength, you'd get to roll 3 ability dice. Mechanically, this may sound very different from anything else we've talked about before, and it really is, but that doesn't mean it's any more difficult to get into. In fact, I think that by removing most of the numbers from the game, Star Wars Edge of the Empire is actually one of the easiest games to learn. Besides your average success and failure, there's also a symbol for advantage and disadvantage. This allows for more complicated outcomes during your stories. For example, a player could roll a success to blast open a door, but if they also roll a disadvantage, then maybe the door is locked permanently and can never be opened again. The same thing can happen in reverse. The player may fail to hit the target that they meant to, but hit an oil slick, and then all of the enemies start to trip. You can see that the interpretation of these symbols is very open, and players and game masters alike can have a hand in figuring out exactly what happens when your dice hit the table. I love Edge of the Empire because it tries out a lot of new ideas that you can't really find in other role-playing games. The vivid storytelling techniques available in Edge of the Empire are a real strength for this title, and I think that people who aren't necessarily interested in the more strategic or miniatures aspects of role-playing games are going to find a lot to love here. We really hope we've helped to define the role-playing game for you, because we know that it can be overwhelming and daunting to get into. We hope you'll invite your friends over and you'll start to roll some dice and pull out some maps and really let your imaginations go wild, because that's when the magic starts to happen. That's when the tabletop role-playing game becomes so much better than the digital experiences that you're used to. As always, you can find us at jetpackjoust.com or facebook.com/jetpackjoust. We're also really active on Twitter @jetpackjoust. Please subscribe to this channel and like this video. The more you support us, the more we can support you with the best board game, role-playing game, and indie game content that we can possibly produce for you. We're going to start ending Hit the Table with a question, and we hope you'll take the time to answer us. Today we're going to ask, based off of our role-playing game discussion, what is the funniest role-playing game story that you have to tell?